Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining today's call on emerging threats facing people experiencing homelessness. Today's call has over 4,200 registrants, so we're just going to give it just a couple more minutes before we begin and get right into the agenda. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again so much for joining today's call. We have over 4,200 registrants, and we just want to give just a few more moments to ensure that people have time to join. We'll be right back with you. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I am Jen Butler, Senior Director of Media Relations and Communications with NLIHC. Thank you once more for joining today's call on emerging threats facing people experiencing homelessness. This is the first call in our four-part series, Housing First, in partnership with the National Alliance to End Homelessness and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. In communities nationwide, the response to the homelessness crisis has been advancing dangerous rhetoric and harmful, dehumanizing measures. So it's more important than ever that we all work together to advance bold policies and anti-racist reforms to ensure that all people experiencing and are at risk of homelessness have safe, stable, and affordable housing. As I mentioned just a moment ago, today's call has over 4,200 registrant, and so it shows how critically important it is that we all work together and take action now. So again, we cannot thank you enough for joining today. We do have a full agenda, and so during the call, we will take a few questions in the Q&A box following the speakers, and we ask that any additional questions that are unanswered be emailed to outreach@nlihc.org, or you can email questions directly to one of the speakers. Again, though, the email address that you can send any questions to is outreach@nlihc.org. Today's call is also recorded and transcribed and will be available to view on demand. We will also send out a follow-up email and a full recap of today's call and presentation slides. So again, if your questions are not answered on the call, please do email us so that we can make sure that we can respond to you. So we will go ahead and jump right on into our agenda. We will hear opening remarks from NLIHC's President and CEO, Diane Yantel, the National Alliance to End Homelessness CEO, Ann Oliva, and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities Vice President for Housing Policy, Peggy Bailey. And first up, we have Diane Yantel.
Yantel, President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining the National Low Income Housing Coalition, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities today. We're so pleased to have nearly 4,000 people registered to join us for this important webinar series on housing first, the most effective way to address and end homelessness in our communities and in our country. So we meet today to talk about solutions to homelessness at a time when the number of people losing their homes and becoming homeless is increasing. And as homelessness increases and becomes increasingly visible, a backlash is growing against proven solutions and against individual people who are experiencing homelessness. It's a troubling and potentially dangerous moment, and it's a time when we all must be unified in speaking up and out about what Housing First is, why it's so effective, its success in addressing homelessness, and the federal resources and solutions that we need to end homelessness in our country once and for all. So how did we get here? Before the pandemic, 10 million of the lowest income households, disproportionately people of color, paid at least half of their limited income on rent. And we had nearly 600,000 people experiencing homelessness on any given night, also disproportionately people of color. And the number of people who were homeless had been increasing for the previous few years. So these same households then, during the pandemic, lost wages, had increased costs, and were at risk of losing their homes. Advocates and impacted people sounded the alarm, and Congress responded with unprecedented resources and protections that ultimately kept millions of renters safely and stably housed and moved many people experiencing homelessness to safety. But now, resources are nearly depleted and protections have expired, and low-income renters and people who are homeless are struggling with rising inflation, skyrocketing rents, eviction filing rates that are reaching or surpassing or have well surpassed pre-pandemic averages, and in many communities, increasing homelessness. Every $100 increase in median monthly rent is associated with a 9% increase in homelessness. Last year, monthly rents increased on average nationally by $200. Rents increased 14% last year, and as high as 30% to 40% increases in some cities. So rents are skyrocketing due to increased demand, limited supply, very limited federal subsidies to make homes affordable for the lowest income people, an unregulated market that allows landlords to raise rents without regard to impact on renters, and an increasing number of predatory institutional investors that are entering the market. And underlying these challenges is the long-standing, pervasive, and severe shortage of 7 million homes affordable and available to people with the lowest incomes, which the private market on its own cannot adequately address. But Congress only funds housing assistance for 1 in 4 eligible households and fails to preserve the country's public and other deeply affordable housing. The solutions are clear and obvious: universal rental assistance, preservation and expansion of deeply affordable homes, short-term assistance to prevent evictions and homelessness, strengthened and enforced renter protections. But the best opportunity to advance these long-term solutions is the reconciliation bill, which the president will sign this week, and it does not address the housing crisis in any meaningful way, despite all of ours and many congressional champions' best efforts. This leaves renters and people experiencing homelessness to suffer from continued inaction. We know how to end homelessness. Communities end homelessness for individuals and families every day, and they do it with housing first. And we know how to stem the tide of people becoming newly homeless with fair, accessible, affordable homes in communities of their choice. What we lack for both is federal resources, renter protections, and the political will to fund proven solutions at the scale needed. So throughout this webinar series, you'll hear from experts from around the country about what we can do now. They'll share more on the threats and the challenges, the impacts. They'll equip us all with data, research, and actions that we must take now and in the future to push back against harmful growing narratives and to address, prevent, and end homelessness. So thanks again very much for being here today, and many thanks again to our partners at the National Alliance to End Homelessness and Center on Budget and Policy Priorities for holding this webinar series with us, and thanks to all of the speakers that we'll hear from today and throughout the series, some of the most effective and dedicated practitioners, advocates, and change makers on homelessness in the country. So now I'm glad to turn it over to my colleague, Ann Oliva, the CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Ann, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Diane. And thanks to all of you out there in the audience for joining today. What an awesome turnout. And I also want to just take the moment that I have the microphone and thank all of my colleagues who are presenting today as well. Like Diane said, we have quite a lineup for all of you, but having over 4,000 people registered for this series, what that tells me is that you all are seeing what we're seeing. And to some extent, that's really alarming for all of us. So as we know, unsheltered homelessness has, according to the HUD point in time count, increased every year since 2015. And I think that we can reasonably expect an increase when HUD releases the 2022 point in time count, not just on the number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, including families with kids, but also of the number of people experiencing chronic homelessness as people who have been on the streets since 2020 aged into chronic homelessness. So this is an incredibly alarming trend. And with this uptick, what we're seeing at the national level, at the state level, and at the local level is more pressure on elected officials by their housed constituents to quote unquote do something. And more visible homelessness has really created a dynamic that we haven't seen in our field, certainly in my time in our field, since the mid-90s, it is becoming overtly politicized in ways that are deeply unhelpful. At the state and local levels, we've started to see some really alarming trends, not just in the data, but in how states and localities are approaching homelessness. We're seeing outside groups with no real expertise shopping regressive legislative packages that take various forms, but that generally include an approach of shifting funding from evidence-based programs that work, like permanent housing and permanent supportive housing and affordable housing, in favor of what I will call kindly camps that simply remove people from public view. Those packages generally also include increasing criminalization and criminalizing people simply for surviving on the streets of our cities and counties, rather than centering what people experiencing homelessness have told us they want and need, which is housing and services. Eric will talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation, but we've seen states like Missouri and Tennessee starting to pass, again, these sort of regressive legislative packages. But it's not only happening in conservative states. We're also concerned about the implementation of some state level packages in California and other places. So this is something that we need to pay attention to nationwide. And it's also really caught attention at the national level, with members of Congress putting forward anti-housing first legislation and former President Trump talking about it in his latest speech in the District of Columbia. So here's the thing. These approaches are often wrapped in compassionate language, and they appeal to elected officials and housed people because, in some cases, because they seem helpful and they seem quick. When we in the field know that they are neither of those things, but actually cause harm to people and disproportionately impact people of color, especially Black people. So it's up to us. Let me get that straight. It is up to us to retake this narrative and educate people on what works and how we should be proceeding, rather than allowing anti-housing first, pro-criminalization narrative to take deeper hold. And I'm not an expert in the narrative field, but we have professionals in the housing and homelessness world who are. We appreciate all of you being here today to do this work alongside us at the national level. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Peggy Bailey.
Thanks, Anne. Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you today, and I'm so and thank you for joining today's call. You know, I was a policy analyst at the National Alliance to End Homelessness when Housing First started really catching on across the country. So it both warms my heart, but depresses me just a little bit, as Anne also alluded to, that we're here today. It's depressing that we still are having to fight about Housing First when it so obviously works. It's frustrating that any solution solutions that center people and what people want and what we hear from those with lived experience that they need are the things that are the hardest and have the steepest road to scale up. But it is also heartening. It's heartening that and energizing that all of you are here today to jump into the fight and continue to press uphill to protect Housing First, but also to push forward. And that's what you'll see in this series, right? What have we learned? What is happening? But how can we continue to improve to make sure that we're ending homelessness for all people? You know, one of the things that I want to make sure we all listen for, though, is that while Housing First is an implementation strategy, it's also a philosophy. And it's the philosophy of it that is allowing us to make sure that as we're ending homelessness, we're thinking about doing it with equity. because housing first helps us as a philosophy, helps us move out of the racism and discrimination that often are the cause of homelessness. It gets us out of the thought that of blaming people for their home, for being homeless and being in poverty in this country, when we know it's because people don't make enough money, we don't support people in their housing, we don't help lift people up, and most of all, we don't listen to what people are telling us that they need to succeed. And so the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities is here today alongside the National Alliance to End Homelessness and the National Low Income Housing Coalition, because as Diane said, it's the lack of universal housing assistance and rental assistance that holds us back from scaling up housing first, not the flaws in the concept or any other issues. It's really this the lack of initiative of investment that is holding us back. And that's what we need to say. When people are saying that housing first isn't working because we haven't ended homelessness, it's not because of the strategy. The strategy is showing us that with housing first, we can reach historic levels of getting people safely housed and connected to services. That's what we're seeing from the emergency housing voucher program. Without housing first, we would never have been able to implement that program in the way that we're seeing across the country, where housers are seeing themselves as service providers and proactively helping people find housing, and not simply bureaucratic entities that are here just to administer rental assistance. And the other special purpose voucher programs also show us the success of housing first. So thank you all again for being today. We're privileged here at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities to be a part of this effort with our colleagues. And with that, I will pass it to Jen.
Thank you so much, Peggy and Diane. Before we move on with our agenda, just a really quick housekeeping, because we do have a very full agenda. For the following speakers, we will take a few questions from the Q&A box. Due to the volume of today's call, we are not utilizing the chat feature, but we ask that you please do use the Q&A box. So we are going to answer just a few of those for the following speakers. So if there are, however, any unanswered or additional questions, please email them to outreach@nlihc.org. Again, that's outreach@nlihc.org, or directly to one of the speakers. Also, following today's call, because this call is going to be recorded and it's transcribed, we will share that with you so you can view it on demand. We will also send out a full recap of today's presentation slides, and also additional helpful resources. And so with that, we will now receive an overview of Housing First from Dr. Valisha Adams-Cullum, President and CEO of the St. Joseph Center.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you for including me in today's really important conversation. And thank you for agreeing to advance my slides. So as you heard, my name is Dr. Valisha Adams-Cullum, and I'm the President and CEO of St. Joseph Center. Next slide. St. Joseph Center is located in Los Angeles, California. We have been serving low-income and homeless individuals for 45 years. We have offices on what we call the west side of LA, which is like the Santa Monica area, for those of you who don't know California, aren't from our neck of the woods. We also have offices in South Los Angeles and in downtown LA. Next slide. Just to give you an idea of the type of work we do, even though I will be providing the overview of Housing First, St. Joe's serves about 15,000 people annually. We have four main pillars of service, which each of these services that you see on the screen fit under one of those pillars: outreach and engagement, housing, mental health, and education and vocational services. So last year, we connected about 2,300 people to housing. We newly housed about 1,100 folks. We engaged almost 4,000 through our street outreach teams. We also had mental health services that were provided both in person and remotely. We have a food pantry that serves 400 to 500 people a week and served about 30,000 last year. We saw a 72% increase in meals served, which really speaks to what our previous presenters said about the increased needs and the struggles that people have endured over the last couple of years, in particular due to COVID. We have seen a 95% retention of those who are housed, and that's using a housing first model, which is why I'm here, and let's just get into it. So next slide, please. Well, you heard Peggy say, and she's right on, that housing first is not just a program model. It is absolutely a system-wide philosophical orientation. It's a way we view the work, the people we serve, and how we in the field have people access our various resources, from emergency shelter, outreach and housing programs, and such. So for someone who's been in this work for over 20 years, I will tell you that I saw the shift from our previous models of more of a linear process of people going into shelter and then perhaps transitional living to get ready, quote unquote, for housing, and then moved into housing. And Housing First absolutely turned that whole program and way of doing the work on its ear. And I'm very proud to be a part of, and one of the early pioneers of Housing First, early adopters as an organization. Next slide. So just to get into what our shift in thinking entailed, what do we mean shift in thinking? One of the ways, it seems sort of basic in our way of approaching, but what we needed to really hunker down on is that homelessness is due to a lack of housing, to a loss of housing. And we get sometimes distracted in this movement about how many people have mental illness who are unhoused. And yes, that is a severe issue and problem. How many people are suffering from drug and alcohol addiction, which is part of the DSM and mental health field. You know, how many people just want to travel, we call the travelers. And really, when Housing First became our philosophical focus, we had to double down on the reality, the systemic reality that people are homeless because they don't have housing. And I guess I think one of the most profound ways that we started thinking differently about the folks that we are serving is that everyone is, we believe, ready for housing. And I think it's really powerful to think we don't have to ready people for housing. People don't have to earn their way into housing. And certainly we've all heard of the sad stories 20 years ago when people had to become even more destabilized to get help. And I would hear families say, you mean I have to go into a shelter from the house I'm about to lose in order to get help? And we know that is a fallacy and an unnecessary use of resources. Permanent housing is a right. We need to be really clear about that. Permanent housing is a right for all. And people should be returned to stabilization and housing as quickly as possible. And we see the deleterious effects of people staying years and years on the streets, families staying in their cars. And so, yes, we need to be move swiftly. And as Peggy said, Housing First philosophy and the way that the funds are coming through as a result has made a huge difference in how swiftly we're able to proceed with people who are hurting and vulnerable. Next slide. So I think it's important to highlight, again, part of that shift is that we know that there are issues that contribute to families and individuals becoming unhoused, but we can address those once a family or individual is permanently housed. And the way we do that is by wrapping services around that person in housing. I love the term, okay, housing first, not housing only. And I think that's why there's been the politicizing and the criminalization and the pushing back on some of these ideas, because the idea is, oh, we're just putting these folks who have been less than focused, have not had a career that was adequate, that maybe they brought it onto themselves. Classic of blaming the victim, blaming the family who's struggling instead of the system that created the vulnerability. And so what we know, though, is families who have been unhoused, individuals who've been unhoused for a long time or even a short time, need support often in housing. And we can bring those resources while moving them swiftly out of cars, out of encampments, into a place that's permanent. The important thing to also note is that most people experiencing homelessness do not need intensive services. So while I'm explaining that it's not housing only, and I'm explaining that we wrap services around individuals and families, and we see often a 95% retention in housing, even those folks who've been unhoused for years and years, often when we get them housed, they remain housed. And it's the work we do of wrapping services around. But do know that the vast majority of people unhoused don't need that deep investment of resources and supportive services. They often need just a little bit of help to get back on their feet. Next slide. Next. Okay, so I'm just going to go through this slide of just how at the system level, we need to be thinking about how to advance and protect housing first. We need to make sure that we have policies and regulations that don't create barriers. We want to make it easier, not more difficult, for people in need to get the resources that we have available. We need to think of now. We need to be responsive. There is a serious crisis afoot of homelessness and the overrepresentation of people of color. And so we need to be making sure that we are low barrier, meaning less hoops, less bureaucracy, more equity, more understanding of the needs, hearing the people, having lived experts who work on our teams, which I'll tell you a little bit about in just a second. And we need to make sure that there's a continuum of supportive services. The coordinated entry system among the homeless service practitioners is really a great way to make sure we have a no wrong door approach, that we're working collaboratively and collectively to come together to ensure that when someone falls out of housing, when someone is coming out of an encampment or years of homelessness, we wrap services around, we work together to ensure that housing is available. And of course, again, with such limited resources, such limited housing resources, it really does take a community response to address the concerns. Next. So as I said, coordinating, making sure we are unified, streamlined, user-friendly, at all levels of our work, we need to make sure that we are including people with lived experience, that people who have been unsheltered, families who have struggled out there, have access to the resources they need, and that they weigh in and help us to be good stewards of that work. And I just can't underscore that enough about how important it is to make sure that we employ people who've been there, who get it, who can inform our policies and practices. Next slide. So I just want to give you a sense of that mindset shift, that not only do service practitioners have to be mindful of and embracing, but we also need to make sure that we help our elected officials at a time when, yes, the house community is very much responding to the increased encampments that they see, the increased number of families that they're seeing out there. And so we need to make sure that the electeds are understanding what this shift looks like. Many of our clients or consumers, folks say, have too many barriers to be successful in housing. That's absolutely not the case. Yes, they do have barriers to housing, but those barriers to housing can be supported with a great deal of critical thinking, creativity, and housing options, being responsive. And as I said before, hiring people who have been unhoused and unsheltered, families who have been out there, hiring them to be a part of the solution and to help us with the no wrong door approach. There's also thinking out there that housing is too expensive for the housing first approach. And while we know that there is a crisis across this country around affordability, we have found that with creative models and ideas around lowering the barrier and making sure that we are targeting those folks who are most in need and responding swiftly, getting families out of cars into housing, that we are actually able to engage our landlords and make some arrangements, and through rapid rehousing dollars and shallow subsidies, we're able to really make a difference in what families can do. And as I said before, most families don't need a lot of support. They need a little bit of support. They need help getting a job and getting a better job. And often they're able to start taking on the rent themselves. And some say clients just aren't ready for housing. Oh, that bugs me so much, that somehow we need to ready people for housing. I guarantee you, all people are ready for housing at a time that they become homeless. Certainly some, because of their level of mental health concerns or disabilities that they may have or challenges, they may need more support for a longer period of time. And of course, the chronically homeless folks that we serve may need us to walk alongside them for many, many years, and they may need permanent supportive housing. And we will be there. But again, housing first means getting them into housing and wrapping those services around once they're stabilized. And again, the most successful housing approach uses the same approach for a model of folks who are working. And we know that we have to be creative, we have to adjust, we have to understand the needs, and we need to make sure that we are responsive. Next slide. So it's not easy, but simple. Households experiencing homelessness are not significantly different than the folks that we serve who are low income households. They have many of the same needs. They have many of the same struggles. And it's important for us to be endeavoring to close those gaps and to be advocates on their behalf. And the majority experience homelessness due to a financial crisis or other type of crisis. And with so many people of color not having a full and complete safety net in their family members, having years and years and being inadequately housed and employed, it means one bad thing can happen, one increase in rent, which you heard earlier, and a family can lose everything. We need to also understand that prolonged exposure to homelessness can really have a negative impact on adults and children. And noting that, of course, children who have been exposed to homelessness have higher levels of emotional and behavioral problems We know they have increased serious health issues. They're more likely to experience separations from their families. And many are suffering from the impact of school mobility, repeating a grade, and so forth. So it's really important that we understand that. I think I just wanted to also pause and say what it is we can do when we are going into encampments, and next slide, and we are helping people who are on the streets. And you've heard that there is a backlash. There is the criminalization of folks who are unsheltered. And there is this sense in many communities across the country, we just want people to go away. We just want to have the visible homeless problem addressed. And here in Los Angeles, many of you may have heard about last summer, due to COVID, we saw a significant increase in people living on the boardwalk of Venice Beach. And it was sad for everyone, both the housed and unhoused community, but particularly the level of vulnerability that we saw of people living in their tents trying to avoid getting COVID. And even though we had the Project Room Keys of the use of those motels for folks who are unsheltered and in congregate shelters who are at great risk of contracting COVID, we were able to really make a difference in their lives and keep them from being hospitalized. We also just saw so many vulnerable people on the boardwalk, and St. Joseph Center was a part of a collaborative effort with the mayor of Los Angeles, Mayor Garcetti, Mike Bonin, our council member, and many of the city and county entities, including Sheila Kuo, our supervisor, where what we decided to do was not agree to do a cleanup of the boardwalk, not agreed to move people around and along, but we did an intervention that included a drone technology assessment of how many people were living out on the boardwalk. And we literally housed 213 people, housed them, not move them. We determined there were 200 at the start of the intervention, and we believe that we housed most or all of those folks who were there last summer. What I'm really excited to hear is that with a housing first approach, we were able to do that and are still now 1 year later at a 75% housing retention rate. So that really flies in the face of people having to be ready, people having to have to go through these steps upon steps to earn their way into housing. We're very pleased to know that there are people dying on the streets that can be housed. We're pleased to know that Housing First is about equity, and it's about no wrong door, and it's about lowering barriers. And so I just wanted you to hold on to that example of the great work you can do out there for communities that are struggling, and provide that immediate access to housing, making sure that there's choice. So everyone we house off the boardwalk got a choice of where they would want to be, both short-term and long-term. And we still have many of those folks from the 213 that we haven't yet housed that are now matched to permanent housing resources. So we've housed about 104 permanently, and then many of them, about 42 in interim housing, who are still matched and waiting for their housing opportunity. So again, consumer choice and self-determination is important. The recovery piece is important to note that we're not forcing people into recovery. Many people, once they get stable, they want to do better. They want better for themselves. They want to get on their meds often. They want to seek a recovery approach in their lives. So that happens often when people start to believe in themselves again. And we are individualizing our approaches and have supportive services, particularly with people who have lived experience on our teams, both managers, directors, and folks who are right there doing outreach. We believe that it's important to integrate people into the community. So we have folks who are right there alongside folks we've recently housed, or folks who are trying to maintain in housing and make sure they're integrated and feel supported. Next slide. So you've heard some of this, principles in action, permanent housing, no time limits. The household is the leaseholder with some conditions. We're making sure that that's driven by the client and not the agency. Service participation is separate from housing. It's not a condition of tenancy, but we find that when you're doing creative housing and supportive services, people want to be engaged. When we have people lived experience out there in those programs, people are responsive because we are giving them what they feel they need. Without preconditions, low barrier. People do not have to get on their meds in order to get housed. They don't have to be sober to be housed. When we know those supportive services and housing make a real difference. There's no housing readiness, as I said. Housing is the foundation for positive change. It is not the reward. People are not earning their way into something that we know is their right. Next slide. So again, we want to make sure that people feel inspired and empowered in their housing spaces. And oftentimes when they feel inspired, heard, and that they trust the people working with them, they often want to be involved in programs, and they want to be involved in groups that we might hold. And they want to be engaged in community, and they need our help. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Felicia. That was an outstanding overview. We actually have a few questions about how communities can increase access to services that may be needed. Housing First is a combination of housing plus services, but often it's hard to fund these services. So what do you recommend?
I mean, that's exactly where advocacy has to come in. We have to work with our local continuums of care. We need to get messages to our local officials to let them know that we don't want people just moved around from one encampment to another, that we want supportive services. I will tell you that we passed a measure, it's called Measure H here in LA County. It's a quarter-cent sales tax. It's given us about $355,000 a year. $355 million a year, and has really helped us overall, and really making sure that we have a plan for how we're going to proceed in addressing the needs of folks in housing, making sure that there's supportive services, meaning case management, that's attached to housing, that there's outreach workers connecting with people in the field. And that measure has really been a game changer here in LA County, even though we know that homelessness continues to increase, and that's because people are falling into homelessness faster than we can get them out. And that is a national crisis and issue that we're facing. I will also say that the philanthropic community is very helpful in innovating around how we can do this work more effectively and how we can make sure that we're wrapping services around families and individuals in housing. So I'm very appreciative of the foundations who are joining us in this work to advance these efforts. And that is truly an amazing effort that we're seeing.
Is it fair to say, that the success of Housing First depends on securing a collaborative relationship with all levels of government?
Well, that's an interesting point, and I believe that collaboration is essential, absolutely essential in our field. Homelessness is so connected to so many other issues and challenges, and we know that our partners at HUD and all of our partners on the call today are critical to advocacy, critical to making sure we have investment and holding the system accountable. So I do absolutely believe that we have to have collaboration at all levels of government, and the local space is critical. The service providers also need to have voice, as do our clients, and making sure that we're engaging people with lived experience.
Thank you so much. Would you mind sharing your email address for any unanswered questions for you?
Absolutely. Would you like me to do it verbally or in the chat?
We can do both.
Okay, so I'll just give you my email, which is V as in Victor, ADAMS, VAdams at stjosephctr.org. And I'll also put it in the chat.
Thanks again so much, Felicia. And we will take any additional questions as well that were unanswered at outreach@nlihc.org. Next, we have Eric Tars, Legal Director with the National Homelessness Law Center, and he will discuss the emerging threats to Housing First. Eric?
Hi, Jen. Thanks so much. I'm not going to come on video because I'm having some health issues. So thanks for people's understanding. But thank you for inviting us to talk about these emerging threats that we at the National Homelessness Law Center have been seeing at the intersection of housing, homelessness, and law enforcement. I want to start with a letter from a woman who wrote to me, Amber Jackminski. Amber is experiencing homelessness in St. Petersburg, Florida, where tourists can sleep on the beach all day, but despite the lack of available shelter beds, they'll arrest you if you try and sleep on the streets at night. The city also has no public toilets available after 11 p.m. But as a human being, sometimes Amber just has to go. She tried not drinking anything after 6 p.m., but that led to a urinary tract infection. So one night, as she huddled behind a bush to pee, she was arrested and charged not only for public urination, but for indecent exposure, a sex crime. So now Amber not only has the immediate penalties of jail time, fines and fees she can't pay, but she also has to register as a sex offender for the rest of her life, making it almost impossible to find housing. That doesn't help her out of homelessness, and it doesn't help St. Petersburg solve either its homelessness or its public urination problems. And unfortunately, this isn't just Amber's story, it's our nation's story. Our 2019 survey of 187 cities across the country found that almost every one of them has some form of law criminalizing homelessness, and these laws are on the rise. Close to 3/4 of cities prohibit camping in public, a 91% increase since 2006. More than half restrict sleeping in public, a 50% increase. A third have citywide bans on loitering, doubling since 2006. And now close to 2/3 have laws restricting living in vehicles, up more than 200% since 2006. And because of racial disparities in homelessness and enforcement patterns, the criminalization of homelessness problem isn't just a justice problem, isn't just a housing problem, it's a racial justice problem. A recent report found that Black adults are up to 9.7 times more likely to receive citations for low-level non-traffic offenses as white adults, and Latinx adults are up to 5.8 times more likely. But however, most jurisdictions don't collect data on the housing status of individuals charged, so we really don't know the full scope of the problem. But the disparities are so great that even the United Nations has condemned the disparate impact of the criminalization of homelessness on BIPOC communities and made specific recommendations to abolish the practice and instead take human rights-based approaches to ending the criminalization of homelessness. And just last week, in fact, the committee again met and had hearings on the US in Geneva, where testimony from directly impacted individuals was being shared, and the US was again called out. We'll be sharing the committee's new recommendations when they come out later this month, and folks should definitely be using them as part of their advocacy to show how far out of step with international norms we are. That said, while BIPOC individuals are disproportionately cited, in absolute terms, white people experiencing homelessness still make up the majority of citations for many of these ordinances criminalizing homelessness. And as Heather McGee reminds us in The Sum of Us, these policies that disproportionately harm Black, Indigenous, and people of color hurt us all. Both of those things are true at the same time, and we can and should be emphasizing that in our advocacy. And because studies show criminalization of homelessness costs 2 to 3 times as much as simply providing housing, continuing to invest these resources into a law enforcement approach to homelessness rather than a housing and services approach actually harms the whole community by draining the resources we need to solve the underlying housing issues that make people homeless in the first place. In fact, more than half the people in some jails are there because of homelessness-related offenses, and law enforcement is spending tens of thousands of hours addressing homelessness rather than focusing on public safety. So criminalization actually harms public safety as well. Indeed, it's not just homeless adults or homeless individuals who are at risk. Does this look like a safe situation for law enforcement? No, it puts them more at risk as well. And that's why the DOJ's COPS office dedicated an entire newsletter to talking about alternatives to criminalization of homelessness so that it could get police and prosecutors out of that role, and why dozens of current and former law enforcement officers have endorsed our Housing, Not Handcuffs campaign. Now, as the earlier stats showed, criminalization is widespread at the municipal level, and that's where it's historically mostly occurred. But last year, we released our first state-level survey, finding state statutes criminalizing homelessness in almost every state. Some of these are archaic Victorian-era statutes against panhandling. Some are Jim Crow-era vagrancy statutes designed to make Black people without jobs into criminals so they could be passed through the 13th Amendment loophole back into enslavement, but all are out of touch with modern constitutional law, public health, and public safety standards. And there's a current danger of new states passing these bills. People may have heard about template legislation being pushed by the Cicero Institute, a so-called think tank founded by Joe Lonsdale, a tech billionaire and venture capitalist with investments in private prisons, who openly mocks concerns about racial and gender equity and uses his billions to create slickly produced videos promoting his views that are getting hundreds of thousands of views. But it's not just about changing public perception, it's about changing policy. And he's hired a team of politically connected lobbyists and staff to go out and promote his, quote, Reducing Street Homelessness Act model bill. This template has 4 primary elements. First, although the authors swear it's not their intent to criminalize homelessness, the bill creates a statewide anti-camming ban with penalties of up to $5,000 and 1 month in jail, and showing they do intend for it to be enforced, the law actually penalizes jurisdictions that refuse to enforce the law with the threat of withholding their homeless funding and other public safety funding. And this law falls hardest on jurisdictions that report a higher than state average per capita rate of homelessness as measured by the point in time count, hijacking this federal requirement and incentivizing communities to underreport in order to avoid the penalties. Some versions, like Texas, even authorize the state attorney general to sue jurisdictions that don't enforce the law. the threat to funding goes deeper as well. Since the passage of the American Rescue Plan, bills introduced on the template include not only state funds, but also any federal funds appropriated for homelessness as well. And it takes the funds intended for permanent housing first approaches and instead diverts them to be only used for short-term parking areas, legalized encampments, or emergency shelters. These have strict drug testing and programmatic requirements and a 6-month time limit, and all with a penalty for noncompliance being eviction from the encampment and being immediately subject to that previous statewide camping ban. But because they take all the funding away from permanent housing resources in order to put it into these temporary measures, there's rarely going to be housing waiting on the other side of that encampment stay, meaning it's basically just a 6-month delay until being subject to the camping ban. And lest anyone think that they're envisioning a safe, welcoming camp environment, the law also explicitly gives immunity from liability for any claims by camp residents about conditions in the encampment for all but intentional or grossly negligent conduct, and waives building codes. The third element is reducing barriers for people experiencing homelessness with mental health disabilities to be committed on a short-term basis and then subject to an outpatient treatment plan with a threat of jail and fines for noncompliance. Again, there's no prescription for housing except for being potentially housed later in jail. The final element is mandating that when homeless outreach teams are created, they have to include police officers who are specifically required to enforce anti-camping laws with the goal to move people into courts, not into housing and services whenever possible. This is all explicitly in their model bill. Half a dozen states introduced these bills in 2021 and 22, and they passed in 3, though in Missouri, it was stopped in its standalone form and was only passed by sneaking into an unrelated bill, which is unconstitutional under their state constitution, and we are looking into a legal challenge now. The bill that passed in Tennessee didn't have some of the other harmful Cicero elements in it, but shockingly, in a state where fair market rent for even a studio is double the minimum wage, they have made it a felony to camp on any property in the state with a penalty of up to 6 years in prison. And in Tennessee, that means also permanent disenfranchisement. So rather than paying the $400 difference between fair market and minimum wage rents, Tennessee would rather pay $1,400 to arrest people for camping and then house them in jail for the next 6 years. Beyond regular criminalization, there's also been a recent trend of proposals that would make it easier to involuntarily commit individuals with mental health or addiction problems. For example, the so-called care court system in California is being heavily pushed by the governor and seems likely to pass the legislature. In the care court system, law enforcement is explicitly empowered to make referrals into these systems, and this obviously has a disparate impact and is likely to result in the segregation of persons with mental disabilities. But given the racialized history and the misuse of involuntary commitment and overdiagnosis of Black individuals with schizophrenia, this effectively is just another way of locking up Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. The good news is that across the country, courts are striking down these laws at high rates, adding the costs of losing litigation to other costs that criminalization imposes on communities. Since 2015, 100% of the challenges to panhandling bans have led to the overturning or repeal of the ordinance. The same goes for 60% of challenges to camping ordinances, 3/4 of loitering bans, and 2/3 of food sharing bans. That said, it's far easier to stop a bad law before it's passed than to fight it through the courts afterwards. So while litigation is a tool that we're happy to have at our disposal, the Law Center is working with fantastic attorneys across the country through our Housing Not Handcuffs network, and it takes a lot of resources to bring these cases, and we can't be everywhere at once. Sorry for the the dog barking. Got a new puppy here. Hold on just a second. So sorry. All right. All that said, it is nice when the courts come through. I wanted to highlight this language from our Martin versus Boise decision here because it's so powerful, not just from the legal side, but for changing the false narrative of personal choice. We've all heard this idea that cities offer ample shelter and services, but some people are just, quote, service resistant. No, it's communities that have been resistant to providing the housing and services that people need. And Martin calls this out. If communities put half the energy and resources into improving outreach and services that they put into coming up with new criminalizing ordinances and enforcing them, we could end homelessness and all of its negative impacts tomorrow. One of the dangers of litigation is also how creative communities get when they're trying to thread these constitutional loopholes. The Martin decision doesn't say that communities can't criminalize homelessness. It just says that they can't enforce those laws in the absence of an adequate alternative. And what is an adequate alternative? Communities are unfortunately in a race to the bottom to try and find out. Many have proposed forms of legal encampments. Former President Trump and others alternate between demonizing the homeless community and then pretending they care about them so much that they just can't leave them out on the streets while we wait for housing, and that moving them to encampments is the compassionate thing to do. They use the language of harm reduction, but harm reduction is based on principles of dignity and autonomy. And again, as the liability waivers in the Cicero bills show, they aren't interested in creating a dignified space. And as for autonomy, if the only way you get people to move into legal encampment is under the threat of arrest, that says far more about you creating a people-resistant environment than the people resisting those services. On the plus side, the Biden administration has been putting its weight behind the principle that housing is a human right, because the real harm-reducing alternative to all of these policies is making sure that people aren't getting criminalized because they aren't in the streets in the first place, because they're in adequate housing. The administration has been helping in other ways as well. In 2021, for the first time, the DOJ included the treatment of homeless persons explicitly in their civil rights investigations of the city of Phoenix, putting other cities on notice that the same could be done to them. As I'm sure many of you know, since 2015, HUD's Continuum of Care funding application has told communities that prevention and reduction of criminalization of homelessness is worth up to 2 points on their applications. I'm not. Okay, there we go. And just last month, HUD announced a new funding application specifically for constructive approaches to unsheltered homelessness, focusing on housing first. So forcing funding to go to criminalization and encampments won't be eligible for this funding, and we should be telling that to state officials. And the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness has recently come out with new guidance on addressing encampments, emphasizing criminalizing only makes things worse and the need to plan for the housing needs of all encampment residents. So we know that criminalization hurts individuals and whole communities, including by robbing resources from the groups on this webinar who are actually trying to do something to end homelessness. So what can you do about it? You can sign up at housing.handcuffs.org to join the more than 3,000 groups and individuals who've already endorsed the campaign, and that'll get you on our listserv where folks are sharing the good, the bad, and the ugly of what's happening across the country. 2, you can obviously oppose these laws criminalizing homelessness that are being proposed and support the repeal of those already passed. There's a lot of tools and talking points at housing.handcuffs.org to help you do that. And it's important to center the directly impacted voices in this. With folks like Amber, you can't necessarily take her letter into those sessions, but you can bring those elected officials' voices or the directly impacted voices with you into those meetings and have them share their stories. As an additional tool, I also wanted to offer another way to help sensitize folks to these issues. The Law Center partnered with the University of Miami to create a click-through role-playing game to help folks virtually live a day in the life of some people experiencing homelessness and poverty and decriminalization of it. And we have some lesson plan materials to go along with it, and you can find these on our website. There's lots more reports and resources at our website, and at housing.handcuffs.org. And please be in touch if you need anything. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was very, very helpful. And you guys can all see Eric's email address, etars at nlchp.org.
And actually, that's an old slide. That's my old email. So it's now
Oh, great.
etars@homelesslaw.org. We just switched over a month ago.
Oh, great. So we'll be sure to put that in the chat as well. Thank you so much, Eric. We do have a question. These criminalizing efforts sound discriminatory under the Fair Housing Act, the ADA, and Olmstead. Have you tried arguing this?
Yes, we have. We have a case right now in San Diego, brought together with Disability Rights California and a number of other groups, looking at their vehicle residency ordinance and oversized vehicle residence ordinances and the discriminatory impacts that those in particular and segregative impacts that those have on people with disabilities living in their vehicles, in recreational vehicles and other large vehicles. So yeah, that's definitely an area that we are exploring. Obviously, these laws do have a disparate impact on communities of color, on people with disabilities, and using criminalization to push people out of certain areas and into other areas can have those segregative effects. So yeah, it's an area that we're working on, but there's no such thing as a slam dunk in this litigation. So there's always ways that communities try to avoid it or fight against it. And really, the answer has been all along that we should be providing that community integrated housing that was supposed to be where people were being deinstitutionalized to as far back to the 1960s, but it never materialized, and that everybody was moved out of the institutions and onto the streets and then into the jails. So yeah, it's definitely one angle that we are looking at among many areas of the law.
Thank you. Another question is, how do we share the information you presented to more people? How do we turn the tide against these harmful efforts?
Well, we have a ton of reports and resources on our website, homelesslaw.org, and at housing.handcuffs.org. There's some talking points, samples, language that you can put into op-eds and other things. I think social media is a great way for folks to be getting this message out. I think one of the kind of key things is getting down to the neighborhood level. In this case I mentioned about the vehicle residency ordinance in San Diego, we actually had a victory at an early stage of the case, got an injunction. The city repealed the ordinance, but then the next day they were mobbed by groups, who were organizing on Nextdoor and these other kind of neighborhood listservs, showing, pictures of poop or, garbage that's supposedly been generated by people living in their vehicles, sending it to their elected officials, and they passed a revised ordinance, 2 weeks later. So what we need is for people to, be in those neighborhood groups and say, yes, I agree, it's outrageous that people have to live in their vehicles on our streets, but then direct that energy into constructive solutions. So, let's find a better place for them, a safe place for them to park, with services, with other things. Let's make sure that we're opening up our communities to deeply affordable housing, but not let's just ban living in the vehicles and force them to move somewhere else when there is nowhere else for them to move. So I think, there's lots of talking points, like I said, on the websites, and people should be putting it out wherever they can put it out.
Great. Thank you again, Eric. We will now hear from Donna Whitehead, Executive Director of the National Coalition for the Homeless, on the impact of these threats on people experiencing homelessness. Donna?
Thank you, Jen, and I want to thank the rest of our panelists today and the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and the National Alliance and the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities for inviting us to be here today. So many of the things that we've heard about today are about programs and policies. We want to bring it home to the people, but before I go into the text of my conversation today, I want to just give you a little bit of background on the National Coalition for the Homeless. The National Coalition for the Homeless is the oldest advocacy group that works on the issue of homelessness. The National Coalition started in the mid-70s and was instrumental in the creation and implementation and passage of the McKinney-Vento Act. NCH believes at its core that in order to end homelessness, that people experiencing homelessness should be involved in all levels, and our leadership and our staff is predominantly made up of people with lived experience. Next slide, please. So we want to just get right into the impacts. And first of all, let me say that in our last presentation, we heard from Amber. And unfortunately, Amber's story is not a unique story. It's one we hear very often, that these criminalization practices can lead to more serious offenses and really have a disparate impact on people's navigation through the issue of homelessness. We know that criminalization exacerbates health problems and creates new ones. People who are forced to move from place to place are often disconnected with the health services that they've been able to acquire while on the streets. We know in particular that this became very apparent during COVID, that people living on the streets were very susceptible to a number of diseases, including COVID. And once they were able to get connected with services that can help with those, oftentimes they were moved weekly, almost in some cases, away from those health services. And they were put in situations where they were absolutely more susceptible to a list of diseases. And also it prevented the people experiencing homelessness from having the medication, the resources that were always available to them in the locations that they started at. And many times, as you'll hear, some of those medications and also medical devices were actually thrown away when encampments were raided. And the two things that are most important about this is that we are talking about human beings. The people experiencing homelessness are foremost people, and these are mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and daughters and sons. They're former co-workers and former classmates. These are people, and what's happening to them on the streets of this country, and I would agree with Anna Levo at the very beginning when she said that we are in a space that is probably worse when it comes to compassion and the treatment of homeless people. We're in a place that we've never been before. Not only did you hear from Eric about the laws that are being put in places like Missouri and Tennessee and Georgia, but people have gone as far as to create initiatives that would make homeless people not able to access the mainland. In Miami, there is an initiative that would force people experiencing homelessness to move to an island. And that particular island also has a hazardous waste facility. So we have gone from the very uncomfortable to the unimaginable as communities have come up with new ways to criminalize people experiencing homelessness. And two things that I hope you get from everything you hear today. One, homelessness is solvable, and people do not choose to be homeless. Those are two very important takeaways. And the third takeaway would be that as communities start to draft solutions to homelessness, people experiencing homelessness should be involved in those decisions. We know that the people that are closest to the problem are closest to the solution, and we have to take advantage of that. And I will say that both HUD and the USICH have introduced measures and made statements that make it more accessible and make it actually a provision of service delivery in the new NOFA that people with lived experience should be involved in every manner. So when we are working on some of the strategies that you've heard about, Housing First is one of those. We know that in order to get homeless people or people experiencing homelessness from the streets to any of those programs requires a continuum of activities that started outreach and moved to permanent housing. So we know that trust is very important in that continuum. Sometimes it takes years, and I have actually managed permanent supportive housing programs myself, and I know that it takes years at times to be able to create that trust. It's a continuous engagement process that moves people to the level that they are able to trust community partners and outreach workers, and criminalization absolutely erodes that trust. There are street outreach workers who are working hard every day, and their work is actually complicated by the fact that people are moved from location to location. Again, sometimes it's on a weekly basis. People come into camps and they move people, and people are in the camps for a number of reasons, but it absolutely erodes the trust. It makes the idea of moving people into housing just a little bit harder because the trust has to be reestablished, and also the location has to be reestablished. When people are moved outside of that place where they've been engaged by street medicine practitioners and outreach workers, they again, that entire process has to be reestablished. It also creates barriers to housing and employment, and it extends the length of time that people remain homeless and unhoused. So when people are accessing housing and employment, criminal records are a really big factor in people being able to be housed. And these measures, this criminalization actually, it actually is a compounding factor. So people sometimes start with low-level offenses like no sleeping or camping. They are given fines. They can't pay the fines, and it ratchets up to the point where they're spending multiple days and years sometimes in jail because of very simple offenses that they could not actually conduct unless they had housing. So you can't, you have to sleep outside if you don't have housing. If there's no place to use the restroom, you have to use the restroom where you're at. And those offenses, as you've seen in Amber's story, can become very complicated offenses that will follow you for the rest of your life, and again, prevent you from housing and employment. Next slide. So, so people also at the very practical level, not only do they lose the trust, but they also lose some of their valuables. Again, that exacerbates their ability to be out of homelessness. So they'll lose identification. We know that identification is a huge challenge when people need to get into housing. So often it takes months to be able to access that identification, things like birth certificates and IDs. Outreach workers work really hard, case managers work really hard to get that identification in place. And once people experiencing homelessness their camps are raided, those kind of things are thrown away. They also lose personal items like the last pictures that they wanted to keep when they left their housing, their clothing, medical devices. We've even heard stories. We talk to homeless people every day, and we've heard stories of people's wheelchairs actually being thrown away. So these are very, there's no compassion involved in these raids. And again, people lose things that are their only worldly possessions. And sometimes those possessions include things that would help them get into housing a lot quicker. It also forces people into isolation. And the results of that may be deadly. Isolated people experiencing homelessness are more susceptible to violence, more susceptible to hate crimes. The National Coalition did a report on hate crimes and we looked at over the past 20 years, what was happening in terms of violence against people that experience homelessness. And we think that when people are made to be other, people are made to be less than, that again, people are more likely to target them with violence. We looked at a 20-year period, and over that 20 years, more people experiencing homelessness died as a result of violence against them simply because they're homeless than all the other protected classes combined. We did a number of studies through those years, and we found that the crimes were as draconian as you could possibly think. They were drownings and beheadings and bombings. And this isn't hyperbole. This is what's actually happening on the streets to people experiencing homelessness. We know today that the lifespan for a person experiencing homelessness is actually people that are homeless die 12 years sooner on average than the general US population. So criminalizing homeless people and moving them away from spaces that would provide them security, care, connection to the greater community can have deadly effects. It also will shorten people's lifespan. And we want people to understand the consequences of this practice. We know that people experiencing homelessness are also disconnected from a community. Sometimes an encampment is the people experiencing homelessness creating a community because they have no other choice but to be where they are. And the community provides safety. It provides a human connection, which is lost. Some people will wander the streets of a community and never hear from another human being for many years. We also know that many of the people who actually live on our streets, it's not the only reason. Again, the population is made up of children, it's made up of mothers, it's made up of victims of domestic violence, it's made up of veterans. But we also know that it's made up of people who have substance abuse issues and people who have mental health issues. And we know that people with mental health issues sometimes make up the majority of the population in some of our county prison systems and county jails. We know in Los Angeles, in fact, it's one of the highest populations of people with mental health issues in the country is in the Los Angeles County Jail, and that would go for jails throughout the country. We also know that, as has been stated, these particular practices, criminalization, is a racial justice issue as well. We know that there's an inordinate amount of people who experience homelessness that are people of color, and there are also an inordinate amount of people who are criminalized because of their homelessness that are people of color. And again, that most often happens to Black people in America. So there are a number of consequences. We are also robbing our communities of people who can make an investment in a community through all kinds of work. I say that with personal experience. I personally experienced homelessness myself. Today, I give back to my community in many ways. There's a million other stories that also have the same kind of outcome. I have a person who we've been working with for 2 years that experienced homelessness throughout their childhood and actually went on to graduate from one of the prominent universities in the country. And after only 2 years is now a homeowner. And I could go on with many, many different stories. So the impact of people experiencing homelessness, the impact on people experiencing homelessness cannot really be quantified. It is a story of just amazing disregard and non-compassion. And we have to change that narrative. We know that the reason that we have so many homeless individuals in this country is that we have never been provided the adequate resources to meet the scale of the problem. And part of that is because of criminalization. We push people away, we disengage them from services, and criminalization has ill effects on both the individual and the community. You heard about some of that from Eric. It costs much less to house a person for a year than it does to put a person in the criminal justice system. We know that through statistics. So you'll hear a little bit later about the many ways that you can help. And I'm encouraging you, I'm asking you, I'm begging you today to get involved in fighting criminalization at whatever sphere of influence you have. We aren't all advocates. We aren't all politically connected, but we do have a sphere of influence. It may be in our church or in our local community. We have to localize these conversations and ensure that people experiencing homelessness do not have to face all of the unpleasant and draconian outcomes that I've talked about. If we could go to the next slide, please. And I want to just leave you with a quote from Martin Luther King. And he says, "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted by the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time." We have to do the work of changing the course of history around homelessness right now. We can not afford to wait longer. All of the organizations that you've heard from have campaigns. We have our own campaign. It's called the Bring America Home Now campaign. What we hope to do in that campaign is, one, help people experiencing homelessness become leaders in their community around the issue of homelessness, and also create the structural change necessary. I encourage you to go to bringamericahomenow.org or contact the National Coalition for the Homeless. Again, we talk to homeless people every day and we can share their perspective, but we know one thing, that criminalizing homelessness does not solve homelessness, and we have to put a stop to it right now. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Donald. And you are absolutely right on the mark. We absolutely have to change the narrative and take action with the fierce urgency of now. Thank you so much, Donald. Due to the time restraints, we do have to actually move forward in our agenda. And so next we will hear from Steve Berg, Vice President for Programs and Policy with the National Alliance to End Homelessness, Sarah Sadian, our Senior Vice President of Public Policy and Field Organizing for NLIHC, Alex Berger, Manager of Government Affairs with the Center on the Budget of Policy Priorities. And they're going to be sharing with us how advocates can take action to ensure that people who are experiencing or at risk of homelessness can have access to safe, stable, affordable housing. And so we'll send it over to Sarah. Sarah?
Hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be here, such inspiring speakers earlier on. I want to share with you a resource that we put together that can help you push back against the harmful, dehumanizing measures that we're seeing gain traction across the country, and to proactively build the congressional support, the political support that we need for long-term real solutions to homelessness and housing poverty. So this is a toolkit we're going to share with all of you in a follow-up email after today's webinar. This toolkit includes all of the resources that you're going to need in order to engage with local elected officials. First, we're asking you to use this resource to take one or more of 4 actions that we outline here. Most important, since of time, I'll make sure that I keep this short, but I want to point out 2 things and some resources that we provide for you. It is really now is the time for you to be scheduling meetings with your elected officials, including members of Congress, and to talk with them about the underlying causes of homelessness and the solutions that we need, talk to them about these harmful criminalizing efforts. We have in our toolkit a link to a meeting request template, tips on how to make sure that your meetings are successful. Now is really the time to be engaging, especially also because your members of Congress are home from recess right now and for the next several weeks. The other thing I want to point out is that one of the most successful ways to make your elected official a champion of housing and homelessness solutions is to invite them to take a tour of an affordable housing development or a housing first program. This is really the best way for them to see firsthand about how these investments at the federal level are reaching their community, gives them an opportunity to talk directly with constituents, including those who might be living in the affordable housing development or benefiting from a housing first program. We include in the toolkit some tips on how to plan for a successful tour and how to start planning now for that sort of an event. We also encourage you to use this time to be lifting up messages to help shape the narrative on social media. You can use our social media messages that we've put together and we link to in the toolkit. And you can also learn how to tell really compelling stories, particularly from those who have lived experience, to add some emotional weight to share the human side to the policies and the numbers that we're talking about. Next slide. The toolkit also includes some talking points that you might want to use when you're talking with your elected officials. This includes talking points on, what are the causes of homelessness? Why are we seeing an increase in our communities? What is housing first? And why are the measures that we talked about earlier, the criminalizing efforts, why are those so harmful and misguided? Next slide. We also include other resources that might be helpful for you as you're engaging with your policymakers. We have links to our state and congressional district profiles. These are documents that outline, what is the shortage of housing in your state or your community, who is most impacted, what's the demographic information, all of the data that you might need to supplement your advocacy at this time. We have fact sheets on housing first, including background information about, what does all the research say about why it's so effective? How has housing first been used to cut veteran homelessness in half? How does it support recovery for people with substance use disorders? We also have very specific talking points that you can use to oppose the Cicero-backed legislation that we mentioned earlier that Eric spoke about. So all of these are resources that might be helpful for you. Next slide. But beyond talking about, the general ideas about homelessness and solutions, there are very specific opportunities that you could use to push for more resources. The first is that Congress has to pass its annual spending bill every year, and this is one of the best places that we have this year to increase funding for long-term solutions to homelessness. So you can use our toolkit to advocate with your members of Congress and encourage them to support the highest level of funding possible in the fiscal year 2023 spending bill, especially for affordable housing and homelessness programs. There are a couple of pieces here I just want to pull out, which is, from our perspective, one of the most meaningful steps that Congress can take this year is to expand access to housing choice vouchers to another 200,000 households as proposed by the president in his budget. We saw the House come in a little bit lower than that. They proposed 140,000 vouchers, but the Senate was very low, and we need to put a lot of pressure on our senators and our representatives to support the highest amount of funding possible, especially for expanding vouchers. Next slide. We also want to build support for long-term solutions. So on a future webinar, we're going to talk about in depth about what are the pillars of support that are needed to end homelessness once and for all. How do we get to a place where we can have universal rental assistance, more homes that are affordable to people with the lowest incomes? How do we stabilize people in their homes and enforce and have stronger renter protections? But until then, we're also going to point to some of these more these other bills that can help move us in that direction. I pulled out 3 of those bills here. These are bills that would create 500,000 new vouchers for families with children, would create permanent programs to provide emergency rental assistance to help stabilize families before they face an eviction or homelessness. And that would ban source of income discrimination to make it easier for people with vouchers to find landlords that are willing to accept them. These are 3 bills that you could use this time to help build congressional support by asking your members of Congress to co-sponsor them. And with that, since I know the time is quick, I'm going to turn it over to Steve, who can talk a little bit more about a virtual Hill Day.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Steve Berg from the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Yes, you can hear me, so here we go. The virtual Hill Day is planned for Wednesday, September 14th, 2022, as you can see up on the slide. We'll be focusing on the kinds of investments that Sarah was just talking about, which we're completely in support of. We'll have help available to people to set up virtual meetings. We've done a number of these virtual Hill Days now since COVID started. They work out really well. It's a chance to have live meetings, live conversations with your members of Congress, and with Hill staff. We'll have a lot of the logistics will be handled by us and by the firm that we work with for this. So if you're interested, please email Jerry Jones, who's on the Alliance's staff. You can see his email right there. That's a great way to get involved in a great opportunity that's coming up soon at a key point in the congressional decision-making process. Next slide, please. So in terms of what to say to Congress, I agree completely with everything Sarah said. We know what to do about homelessness. That's an important thing to get across in a context where all these different bad ideas are being floated around about homelessness. It's important to be very clear. We know what to do about it. We've known what to do about it for a long time. The housing first approach is the right thing to do about it. It's working in your community. It's working. If it's not working so well in your community, there are plenty of other places where it is working really well. So you can get good examples. And it's spending in these housing and homelessness bills that are going to take that to scale. The thing that's missing is sufficient spending on homelessness and housing interventions, and that's what we're going to be talking to these members of Congress about on Hill Day. Next slide, please. And just so you know, the key sort of thing that's still alive in Congress for this year are these annual spending bills that Sarah was talking about. We don't know exactly when those are going to move forward. It's a little stuck right now because of disagreements over sort of how much money will be spent on different things. They require 60 votes in the Senate, so there's got to be bipartisan agreement on how to move forward. So it may be later, it may be after the election even, but one thing we've learned about these election year appropriations fights is that certain things can get closed out much earlier. There may be an agreement on how much to spend on homeless assistance much earlier than the total bill gets passed. So it's important to get a drumbeat going now, to keep it going. The September 14th the September 14th event will be a great time to do that. So let me turn it over briefly to Alex to give their point of view on this. That's how to get a hold of me.
Thanks so much, Steve, and good afternoon, everyone. As it says here, my name is Alex Berger. I'm the Manager of Government Affairs here at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. I know we're over time, so I'll be incredibly quick. The only thing I really want to add to Steve and Sarah's really thorough and important presentation on the legislative state of affairs and all the things that we can be doing right now is just to not forget the importance of strange bedfellows in this conversation. By that, I mean reaching out to groups that not necessarily think only about housing or homelessness, but really to expand our networks and extend our alliances to groups that care about human needs And that really spans the gambit, whether that's food banks, educational associations, renters associations, other groups that really just have at the heart of what they do, people and people-centric efforts. And so again, reaching out to faith groups, reaching out to hunger groups, reaching out to groups that are focused on community aid and otherwise, continuing to expand that reach, because truly the only way we get success in this fight and success in these efforts to create a better and stronger society is to band together. And so simply at the end of this, I just wanted to put in a plug for continuing to expand your outreach to groups that may not necessarily on its face look like they'd be interested working on issues like this, but really truly at their heart are. So I want to just put in that plug. I'm super excited to be on this call today, and I'll pass it back over.
Thanks so
Thank you
much.
so much. Oh, sorry, Sarah.
Sorry about that. I just wanted to thank everybody for joining today's webinar. Our next webinar is going to be in 2 weeks on Monday, August 29th from 2:30 to 4 o'clock. We're going to hear from experts who are going to share more about how the housing crisis leads to more homelessness. We'll hear success stories from local communities that are using Housing First to reduce homelessness. We're going to talk about how Housing First works specifically for people with mental health issues or substance use disorders. And we're going to learn more about some of the threats that we spoke about today that are facing people experiencing homelessness and all we can do to stop them. So I want to thank everybody for joining and hope you guys can join with us next time. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.